Hey YouTube, welcome back to the channel. Today, I wanted to take a minute and talk to you guys about something that's important to me, something I've encountered in my career many times, and that's the repeated release of both violent and non-violent offenders. In America, you often hear the trope about people spending their life behind bars for minor crimes. Without getting into the details of some of the cases like that, let's talk about the majority of cases, in which we see people with numerous prior arrests released repeatedly, oftentimes with no real jail time ever being served. But why does this happen? I'll be showing you guys some recent cases as we go along, so we can hopefully try to figure out together what's wrong with our justice system. For those of you who are new here, my name is Blue, and I'm a Florida police officer with 10 years of experience. We talk all things true crime here, so if you're interested in that, consider subscribing. With all that said, let's get into today's case. Let's start off with a very recent case, a stabbing spree in Manhattan that left 3 people dead. On November 18th of this year, 51-year-old Ramon Rivera, for seemingly no reason, armed himself with a large knife and began to stab people randomly on the Manhattan streets. So let's build a quick timeline of the attack. At 8:20 a.m., Rivera walked up to a random construction site and attacked one of the workers, stabbing him in the stomach. A nearby doorman was the first to hear the screams of a woman who witnessed the attack and called 911. The worker, 36-year-old Angel Landy, was rushed to the hospital, but sadly passed away from his injuries. Police saturated the area, but Rivera had already slipped away into the mass mourning crowds of Manhattan. 2 hours later, Rivera would come across a 67-year-old Chang Wang, who was fishing in the early morning hours. Rivera rushed Chang and stabbed him repeatedly, before again fleeing the scene and disappearing into the crowds. But Rivera's final attack would come just 25 minutes later, when he came across 36-year-old Wilma Augustin, a single mother to an 8-year-old. Rivera's attack was just as brutal, swift, and random as the others, and Wilma was eventually rushed to the hospital, where despite fighting for her life for hours, she succumbed to her injuries. Rivera walks off again, but this time is followed by a cab driver, who flags down an officer and points out Rivera. NYPD officer Garvey detains Rivera, initially believing that he was a part of some type of robbery. But he finds 2 blood-covered knives on Rivera, and notes that he is covered in blood, with no apparent injuries to himself. From here, police quickly connected the citywide stabbings to Rivera. But this only comes after 3 people were brutally murdered in broad daylight, again, for no reason at all. So what drove Rivera to do this? Should we have seen this coming, and was there any way to prevent this? You see, Rivera had been arrested 8 times in Manhattan alone, just that year. 5 of those arrests were for felonies, that is, burglary. 1 was for assault, for attacking a worker at a psychiatric ward. Now we'll get into those cases in a bit, but in December of 2023, Rivera is released from jail after being arrested for a misdemeanor theft. The same day, he is arrested again for stealing a $1,500 item from a designer shop, a felony charge. On this case, his defense attorneys of course argued that he should be released with no bail. Going back to those burglaries, Rivera is actually arrested for them on February 19th of 2024. Most of these burglaries happened when he had just been released a second time from custody. What a shock. Prosecutors combined these multiple felony charges into one charge, and during the course of the trial, Rivera stays locked up. While locked up in the jail's psych ward, he assaults a corrections officer, like we discussed before, yet another felony. Ultimately, instead of going to trial, for which the prosecution likely would have won, they offer Rivera a plea deal. Plead to burglary and you'll get a 364-day sentence. Rivera, of course, takes the deal. In addition to that, Rivera also gets a plea deal for assaulting the corrections officer, something that gets him a 90-day sentence. That sentence, by the way, is served concurrently with the 364-day sentence. Generally, what that means is that instead of serving these sentences back to back, he gets to serve them at the exact same time, meaning he gets out of jail that much sooner. And here's the kicker. Even with that light sentence, Rivera somehow manages to get released even sooner than that. After serving just 3/4 or 9 months of his sentence, he walks free. So why? Why? With all these charges, why was he released? With all these felony convictions, why is he getting such a light sentence? When courts decide to issue a bond, they normally look at several factors. What is the nature of the crime? Obviously, a simple disorderly conduct or trespassing arrest is not the same as a burglary or an assault charge. They also look at whether or not this person is likely to reoffend. Do they have ties to the community, or are they likely to flee upon their release, or at least not show up for court? A tie to the community in most cases is considered a home, a job, or family in the area, none of which Rivera had. Just to recap, Rivera has a lengthy criminal record, with 8 arrests alone in the last year, including multiple felonies. Rivera is obviously a reoffender risk, and is also someone who is known to be mentally ill, with no ties to the community. In every case, he should be denied bond and held until his trial date, or at the very least be given a bond that is fair with the charge, something that based on the situation would have kept him incarcerated. And yet, he was released. And that's without even getting into the literal slap on the wrist sentence that he was handed down. Let's talk about a bill that came into play in about 2019. The New York Bail Reform Act of 2019 initially made misdemeanors and lower-level nonviolent felonies not require bail. Because this was obviously a bad idea, multiple exceptions have been made to this rule, but the rule still stands. Here's a quote showing how advocates justify this bail reform. They say, by reducing reliance on cash bail, reform efforts ensure that people are not detained solely because they cannot afford bail, promoting fairness and reducing unnecessary pretrial incarceration. This allows individuals to maintain employment, housing, and familial ties, reducing the likelihood of reoffending. But did Rivera have any of those things? As we just discussed, no, he certainly did not. And yet, we showed him repeated acts of mercy, grace, and preference, not only when he did not deserve it, but at the expense of the safety of our fellow Americans, ultimately costing the lives of 3 innocent people, all under the guise of fairness. And now, Rivera, if found fit to stand trial, will finally be put where he belongs, where he's always belonged, in a prison or an asylum, separate from the rest of society. The sister of Rivera's first victim, Angel Landy, showed up to Rivera's court hearing and stated, "Justice needs to be served. I don't want my brother to have died in vain." I applaud her for showing up and ensuring her brother's voice is heard, and doing everything in her power to ensure he gets justice for this. But the sad truth remains that her brother likely did die in vain, in a random, meaningless attack committed by a perpetrator who never should have been on the streets. And this is sadly just one example of many. Our second story keeps us in New York, this time taking us to a criminal with an extensive, and I mean extensive, criminal history. And the failures of our criminal justice system resulted in even more innocent people being victimized. In June of 2021, our suspect sucker punches a random woman, for no reason at all and with no warning. Let's take a look at the video, which, fair warning, may be disturbing, but I think you need to see it.
You hit me, fool!
Listen.
Why you hit me?
Hey. You okay?
He absolutely hammered that poor woman, who clearly never saw it coming. She almost appears to be knocked out, or at the least severely dazed. Now this man, Alexander Wright, has 41 prior arrests. 41. The arrest just prior to this one was for throwing scalding water on 2 traffic workers. And honestly, regardless of what the rest of those charges are for, we have to ask ourselves as a society, what is somebody like this doing still walking the streets? And look who pays the price. Imagine if this had happened to your mother, your daughter, your sister, or your friend. I know many men who likely would have ended up in prison themselves had they witnessed this attack. And you might think that maybe, after 40 plus arrests and the viral footage of this attack on this poor woman, we would finally be able to lock him up for some meaningful period of time, to do whatever we could do to try to keep society safe. Sadly, you'd be wrong. In August 11th of 2023, Wright attacked an MTA worker after the worker confronted him about harassing passengers. During the confrontation with Wright, he was viciously attacked. The attack was so serious that the victim, Anthony Nelson, was hospitalized with a broken collarbone and a dislocated nose. Anthony's family rightly spoke out, asking the courts to punish Wright to the fullest extent of the law. Unfortunately, in February of 2023, Wright was deemed to be unfit to stand trial by the Supreme Court of New York. Because of this, he was ordered to a psych facility until such time as he is seen fit to stand trial. In many cases, this would mean that the family would eventually get tired of waiting, stop showing up to court, causing the charges to be dropped. I cannot stress to you all how often this happens, and aside from all the flaws in our justice system, is one of the major reasons people walk free after committing so many of these heinous crimes. But in this case, the family is still calling out for justice, and Nelson's mother even said she is sick of mentally ill people being granted amnesty for their crimes. Nelson and his family are receiving support both from the MTA and prosecutors, as all parties stand committed to bringing these charges through, and prosecutors say they're ready for trial. In August of 2024, a court judge stated that Wright still needed more time in treatment before he would be considered fit for trial, something that understandably frustrates the victim and his family in this case. Wright was due back in court on September 26th of this year. Now, the latest news is that Wright was deemed fit, finally, to stand trial. So what did our court system do? We released him on a $500 bond, which Wright posted. $500. I'm sure this comes as a shock to everyone, but Wright didn't show up for that court hearing on the 26th, like he promised he would. Who could have seen it coming? So the courts, instead of authorizing an immediate arrest warrant, reset Wright's appearance for Monday, September 30th. And wouldn't you know it, he just couldn't find the time to show up for that one either. So finally, the courts issued an arrest warrant for Wright, someone who never should have been out of jail in the first place.
There's now an arrest warrant out for a man accused of assaulting an MTA worker on the job, and it comes after he skipped yet another court appearance. News 12's Julia Burns at the Bronx County Hall of Justice with those latest details.
It's yet another pushback in what MTA worker Anthony Nelson is calling delayed justice.
I lost a big chunk of my life. This 2 years have been the lowest point of my life ever.
And that is the latest on the case, at least that I could find. People are and have been losing faith in our justice system for a long time, and with cases like this, it's easy to see why. But what are your thoughts on these cases? Do you think it's right that we have and continue to give so many second chances to criminals like this? And what are the alternatives? One major alternative, I think, is institutionalization, or rather, the long-term commitment of the severely mentally ill to faculties with the training and room to safely house and treat people like the ones we've discussed. Some would say that in the cases of Rivera and Wright, they're deeply mentally ill, and are likely being made worse by their time in jail and on the street. To a large extent, I agree. And I think the answer is to, in some capacity, bring back long-term care facilities, what were once called asylums. I'll probably be doing a video on the shutdown of these facilities nationwide, and how it likely led to these problems we've been experiencing for the last few decades, that seems to only be getting worse now. If you guys have any recommendations on cases that you would like to hear my thoughts on, go ahead and leave it down there as well. And as always guys, stay safe and stay tuned.